The surface of the pool rippled slowly, waves catching shards of golden light as laughter echoed above. Then came the shove, the sudden plunge. Cassie Monroe, the quiet black maid, sank into the cold blue depths, her simple uniform clinging tight, her breath stolen. Faces hovered distorted above the water, their mocking smiles blurred by the shifting surface. A sharp cry broke free, then silence. Sometimes, the quietest souls carry the fiercest secrets. On that night in Green Ridge, Texas, the girl they thought invisible would rise, and her strength would shake an entire town. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe, share the video, and leave a comment. May your day be blessed and filled with courage. The autumn sun had not yet broken fully across the horizon when the first hints of orange light crept over the still surface of Lake Green Ridge. The town of Green Ridge, Texas, was a place caught between two worlds. Its heart was rural, proud of ranch land and cattle drives, but the new money brought in by oil and real estate had transformed parts of the lakeside into estates of stone and glass. The air that morning carried the faint chill of early October, crisp and sharp, promising a day that would warm quickly under the southern sun. The lake itself lay quiet, disturbed only by the soft dip of a heron's wings as it glided low across the water. A line of grand houses rose along the shoreline, their manicured lawns sloping to the edges of private piers, the kind of homes that looked like fortresses built not just to keep weather out, but to keep the world at bay. In one of those houses, a sprawling property belonging to the Whitman family, Cassandra Monroe moved quietly from room to room. 19 years old, Cassie, as she was called by those who noticed her at all, was slender, with deep brown skin that caught the light in warm tones. She stood at a modest height, her posture straight but not stiff, more from years of necessity than vanity. Her hair, tightly coiled and usually pulled into a simple bun at the back of her head, framed a face both youthful and old at once, youthful in its softness, but marked by a weariness that came from responsibility too heavy for her age. Cassie's eyes, a dark chestnut brown, were watchful and guarded, holding both determination and a lingering sadness. She was quiet by nature, speaking only when needed, and this silence had become her armor. Yet beneath that calm exterior lived a fire she rarely allowed the world to glimpse. Cassie wore the uniform of the house staff, a pale gray cotton dress with short sleeves, practical and plain, an apron tied neatly at her waist. It was not flattering, but it served its purpose. Nobody cared to notice whether it flattered her anyway. She moved with the grace of someone who had long since learned that efficiency was a shield against criticism. If she did her work quickly and without fuss, she could pass through the day like a shadow. The Whitman mansion smelled faintly of polished wood and lemon oil. Its wide hallways were lined with portraits of ancestors, most of them stern-faced men in suits and women draped in pearls, their painted gazes following anyone who walked by. Cassie had grown used to their judgment, as she had grown used to the judgment of the living Whitmans. At the far end of the hall, the sound of clinking glass carried faintly from the kitchen. Mrs. Irene Whitman, the matriarch of the house, stood at the counter with her morning tea. Irene was a woman in her early 50s, tall and sharp-featured, with auburn hair perfectly styled even at dawn. Her thin lips rarely softened into a smile, and her pale blue eyes were quick to appraise and quicker to dismiss. She wore a silk robe of deep emerald, embroidered with subtle patterns, and diamond studs that sparkled even in the soft kitchen light. Though she had never spoken cruel words to Cassie outright, her silence carried its own weight, the kind of silence that made Cassie feel invisible, as if she were nothing more than the hum of the refrigerator or the creak of the floorboards. "Coffee for Mr. Whitman," Irene said without looking up from her newspaper. Her voice was clipped, efficient, as if Cassie were merely an extension of the stove. "Yes, ma'am," Cassie replied softly. Mr. Robert Whitman, Irene's husband and the mayor of Green Ridge, was a man of stature and presence. At 56, he was tall, broad-shouldered, with silver streaks at his temples that gave him an air of distinguished authority. His steel gray eyes could turn warm in public speeches but cold in private, and his deep baritone voice was practiced to command a room. He entered the kitchen just as Cassie set the coffee pot on the counter, his dark tailored suit crisp despite the early hour. He glanced at her briefly, a nod that was more reflex than acknowledgement, before sitting down with the newspaper his wife had just set aside. Cassie moved silently, placing the steaming mug in front of him. Their son, Bradley Whitman, soon joined. Bradley was 21, lean and athletic, his blonde hair perpetually styled as though for a magazine shoot. His blue eyes mirrored his mother's sharpness, though his grin could charm most people in town. He was the golden boy of Greenridge, captain of his college swim team, and heir apparent to his father's influence. To Cassie, however, Bradley was another form of danger-mocking laughter often followed her when he was near, his remarks cloaked in the kind of cruel humor that privileged boys mistake for wit. The Whitmans were Cassie's employers, and though they never said it aloud, she knew they considered her presence necessary but insignificant. She was there to serve, to polish, to wash, to cook, to disappear. But Cassie carried a purpose they could not see. Her younger brother Eli Monroe, just 12 years old, lay in a hospital bed across town. Eli was slender and pale, his brown eyes too often shadowed with pain. Born with a congenital heart defect, his health had grown fragile over the years, and doctors had recently informed Cassie that surgery was essential if he was to survive into adulthood. The cost was staggering, far beyond what Cassie could afford on her wages, yet she had no choice but to try. Every dollar mattered, every hour of work mattered. She had promised her mother before illness had claimed her that she would protect Eli at all costs. That promise was now the heartbeat of Cassie's life. Eli was the reason she woke before dawn, the reason she endured the dismissive stares and the cruel whispers. He was the reason she bent her back and quieted her voice. Cassie's silence was not weakness, it was sacrifice. As the morning wore on, Cassie scrubbed the marble counters until they shone, carried linens up and down the grand staircase, and polished silverware that gleamed like mirrors. Outside, the Texas sun had risen higher, burning off the early chill, and the lake sparkled beneath its warmth. When Cassie slipped outside briefly to gather her breath, she found herself near the side garden, where the Whitmans' neighbor had stopped to chat with Irene. Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell, a widow in her late 60s, stood leaning on a cane. Eleanor had snow-white hair cropped short, kind hazel eyes, and a soft smile that carried both warmth and mischief. She had always been one of the few in Greenridge who treated Cassie like a person rather than an object. "Morning, Cassie," Eleanor said kindly, her voice gentle but firm, as though reminding the world that kindness was not weakness. "Morning, ma'am," Cassie replied, allowing herself the faintest smile. Eleanor's presence was a brief balm, though it reminded Cassie of what she lacked someone to look at her and see her. She returned to work quickly before Irene could scold her for lingering. By the time afternoon settled in, the Whitman estate bustled with preparations for the evening's social gathering. The Whitmans often hosted parties, occasions that drew in the wealthy families of Greenridge and left the staff scurrying like ants. Cassie worked tirelessly in the kitchen alongside Mrs. Clara Jenkins, the head cook. Clara was a stout woman in her 40s, with curly black hair tucked beneath a scarf and an easy laugh that filled the room. She was one of the few who tried to shield Cassie when Bradley's jokes cut too sharp. "You hold your chin up, girl," Clara said softly as she stirred a pot of sauce. "They think you're invisible, but I see you. And so does your brother. Remember that?" Cassie nodded, the words lodging in her chest like a secret flame. As twilight approached, Cassie slipped into her small quarters behind the kitchen, a modest room with a single bed and a wooden dresser. On the nightstand sat a photograph of Eli, his smile bright despite the hospital gown he wore. Cassie touched the frame gently. "I'll get us through this, Eli," she whispered. "Just hold on a little longer." The wind outside carried the scent of the lake, and the sound of laughter drifted faintly from the grand hall where guests had begun to gather. Cassie knew she would soon be called to serve drinks, to carry trays, to move silently among the wealthy who never truly saw her. She straightened her dress, tied her apron tighter, and steeled herself for another evening of invisibility. But invisibility had a cost, and though Cassie did not yet know it, the night would soon come when she could no longer remain unseen. For now, she carried her silence like a shield, her love for Eli like a compass, and her resilience like a weapon still hidden. The night had been restless for Cassie. Even after the Whitmans' gathering ended and the guests had gone home, laughter still clung to the corners of the great hall like smoke. She rose before dawn, as always, her body aching but her spirit steady, and worked her way through another long morning of cleaning before she was summoned once more. By noon the sun burned hot above Lake Greenridge, sharp reflections dancing on the rippling surface, and the air vibrated with the chirr of cicadas. The Whitman estate was alive again, this time with a poolside celebration that seemed designed not for relaxation, but for spectacle. Rows of white lounge chairs lined the sparkling blue pool, while a bar shaded by a wide umbrella brimmed with drinks. The sound of music, sharp, thumping pop hits poured from speakers, filling the manicured yard. Cassie moved quietly with a tray of drinks balanced expertly in her hands. The white dress shirt and black skirt she had been given for event service clung uncomfortably in the heat, and her shoes, too tight from long wear, pinched her heels. She kept her head bowed as she stepped carefully across the slippery stone tiles. At the far side of the pool, Heather Whitman presided like royalty. Heather was 18, only a year younger than Cassie, but her aura of entitlement made her seem untouchable. She was tall and slender, with auburn hair that gleamed in the sunlight, teased into curls that never seemed to wilt despite the humidity. Her eyes, a clear blue, carried a sharpness that often turned cruel, and her lips curled easily into a smirk. Dressed in a bright red swimsuit with a white linen cover draped over her shoulders, she commanded the attention of everyone around her. Beside her lounged Marcy Turner, Heather's closest friend. Marcy, 17, had curly blonde hair and freckles sprinkled across her nose. She was shorter, softer, and often echoed Heather's laughter in order to stay close to her orbit. Her nervous giggle betrayed that she sometimes questioned Heather's cruelty but lacked the courage to step away. Flanking them was Jason Crowley, the son of a wealthy car dealer. Jason was tall and broad-shouldered, his sandy blonde hair kept short, and his body toned from football practice. At 18, he already walked with the swagger of someone convinced the world owed him success. His smirk, quick and mocking, rarely left his face when Cassie was near. Another boy, Kevin Myers, leaned against the bar with a bottle of soda in hand. Kevin was 16, lanky, his brown hair messy and his green eyes constantly darting, as if checking whether Heather approved of his every move. He was more follower than leader, but in Heather's group, that was enough. The group's laughter rose as Cassie approached, the tray balanced carefully. Heather's eyes lit up with the familiar gleam of opportunity, the kind of gleam Cassie had seen many times before, when someone with power decided the powerless would make a convenient joke. "Careful now, Cassie," Heather said, her voice carrying above the music. "Wouldn't want to spill Daddy's expensive wine, would you?" The others laughed, Jason snorting loudly, Marcy's giggle following half a beat later. Cassie kept her gaze low, her lips pressed together, her silence her only shield. She lowered the tray carefully onto the small table beside them, her movement steady. But as she turned to leave, Heather's hand shot out, brushing deliberately against her arm, pushing lightly. Just enough. The shove caught Cassie off balance. Her heels slipped on the wet tile, the tray clattered against the stone, and the next moment she was falling. The shock of the cold water seized her chest as she plunged into the deep end of the pool. The music above distorted instantly, muffled through the rushing blue. Bubbles streamed upward, light fractured into shards across the rippling surface. For a heartbeat, panic overtook her. Her limbs flailed, her lungs screamed for air. But then, through the watery chaos, memory struck her with the force of a tidal wave. She was 8 again, barefoot in her grandfather's backyard. Her grandfather, Sergeant Henry Monroe, had been a towering man, broad and weathered, his skin the deep brown of someone who had labored under the southern sun all his life. His hair had gone silver early, and his voice carried the weight of both discipline and love. A veteran of Vietnam, he bore scars both visible and unseen, one long across his forearm, another hidden deep in his chest. Yet with Cassie he had always been gentle, teaching her lessons not with words, but with action. "You never know when the world's going to try to push you down, girl," he would say, his dark eyes steady. "So you learn how to stand up even when it's water all around you." He had taught her the basics of self-defense in secret, away from the eyes of those who might disapprove. How to fall without breaking. How to twist her body to find leverage. How to strike not with anger, but with precision. She had practiced on the packed dirt of his yard until her legs ached and her arms trembled. And he had always ended the lessons the same way, with a hug that told her she was capable of more than she believed. The memory ignited something within her now. Cassie's panic faded, replaced by instinct. She tucked her chin, angled her body, and kicked upward with strength born of repetition. Her arms cut cleanly through the water, each stroke measured. Her chest burned, but her mind was calm. She broke the surface with a gasp, water streaming down her face, her braid heavy against her back. Laughter erupted around the pool. Heather clapped her hands. Jason whistled. Kevin chuckled nervously. "Look at her!" Jason crowed. "Didn't know the help could swim." Cassie wiped water from her eyes, her breath still ragged. She pulled herself to the edge, fingers gripping the rough stone. But before she could climb out, Heather leaned closer, her smile sharp as glass. "Relax, Cassie," Heather said sweetly, though her voice dripped venom. "It was just a joke." "You don't mind being the entertainment, do you?" The others laughed again. Cassie met Heather's gaze for the briefest moment, and in that instant something flickered in her eyes, a spark, a warning, though small enough that no one noticed. She said nothing. Slowly she climbed from the pool, her clothes clinging heavily, her shoes squelching water onto the stone. She stood dripping, silent, and walked back toward the kitchen, leaving wet footprints behind her. From the shadows of the patio, another figure had been watching. Marcus Reed, a groundskeeper employed by the Whitmans, leaned on his rake and frowned. Marcus was in his early 40s, tall and wiry, with weathered skin and calloused hands. His dark hair was streaked with gray, and his brown eyes carried the weight of a man who had seen too much disappointment. Unlike the Whitmans, Marcus knew hardship. His family had lost their farm years earlier, and now he worked where he could, often for the very people who had benefited from others' misfortune. He had always admired Cassie's quiet determination, and seeing her pushed into the pool stirred anger in him. "You all right, Cassie?" he called softly when she passed near. Cassie only nodded, unwilling to let her voice betray the tremor still in her chest. She retreated to her small room behind the kitchen, peeling off her wet clothes and replacing them with the spare uniform she kept folded neatly in her dresser. As she wrung out her braid and stared into the cracked mirror, she could almost hear her grandfather's voice again. "Stand up, girl, even when it's water all around you." That night, long after the party ended, Cassie lay awake. Outside, the cicadas sang and the lake lapped gently against the pier. But within her, a storm had begun to stir. She had been pushed, mocked, humiliated, and though she had endured silently, her body remembered how to fight back. The lessons of Sergeant Henry Monroe were not gone. They lived in her bones, in her breath, in the spark that had glimmered in her eyes when Heather tried to belittle her. Cassie's silence had always been her shield, but now, she wondered, could it also become her sword? The next morning dawned heavy with gray clouds pressing low over Lake Greenridge, muting the usual brilliance of the Texas sun. The air smelled faintly of rain and earth, a thickness that clung to the skin. Cassie moved through the Whitman kitchen with mechanical precision, scrubbing, polishing, serving, her mind elsewhere. The echoes of laughter at the pool still gnawed at her bones, not because she had been mocked, but because something within her had stirred, a refusal she had not felt in years. By noon, the Whitmans' estate was alive once again. Heather had summoned her circle of friends for another gathering. this time under the pretense of a casual lunch. To Cassie, it felt more like a staged performance. The girls lounged near the veranda in pastel sundresses, their manicured nails clinking against glasses of lemonade. Jason leaned against a column, shirt unbuttoned halfway to reveal a chest he clearly wanted noticed, while Kevin trailed behind him like a shadow. Cassie carried out a tray of sandwiches, careful to keep her step steady. As she bent to place the platter on the table, Heather's voice rang out, cold and deliberate. "Don't trip this time, Cassie," she said, her lips curving in a cruel smile. The others snickered. Cassie straightened slowly, her face impassive. But Jason, always eager to impress Heather, decided the game needed escalation. He moved suddenly, flicking his hand to shove the tray from her grip. Plates crashed to the ground, shards of porcelain scattering across the stone. The sharp crack echoed. Something in Cassie's body acted before her mind did. Jason reached for her arm as if to spin her around for more humiliation. But Cassie's wrist twisted sharply, redirecting his grasp, her movement swift and economical. In one seamless motion, she stepped aside and used his momentum against him, sending him stumbling forward until his knees struck the stone with a thud. The laughter died instantly. Heather's eyes widened, disbelief painted across her perfect face. Marcy gasped audibly, one hand covering her mouth. Kevin's soda bottle slipped from his fingers, spilling sticky liquid across the ground. Jason scrambled up, red with anger, his pride more bruised than his knees. He lunged again, but this time Cassie sidestepped and delivered a precise strike with the heel of her palm-controlled, not cruel straight into his chest. The air whooshed from him as he staggered back, coughing. Silence. Cassie stood still, breathing steady, water-dark eyes calm yet sharp. For a fleeting moment, the mask she always wore, of servitude, of silence, slipped away, revealing a glimpse of the fighter within. "Enough," she said quietly, her voice carrying in the stunned quiet. And then she turned, walked back toward the kitchen, and closed the door behind her, leaving the group staring after her as if they had seen a ghost. Within hours, whispers spread through Greenridge like wildfire. In the grocery store, at the gas station, in the narrow aisles of the town library, people leaned close to murmur, "The Monroe girl, the housemaid. She knows how to fight. Did you hear? Took Jason Crowley down like he was nothing. In a town where everyone knew everything, secrets had the lifespan of a candle in the wind." By evening, even Marcus Reed, the groundskeeper, had caught wind of the gossip. He found Cassie near the tool shed, scrubbing buckets as if scrubbing away the memory of the day. "Words traveling fast," Marcus said, his voice low, his brown eyes filled with something between admiration and concern. "People don't forget moments like that. Especially not folks around here." Cassie kept her gaze on the ground. "I didn't mean to. I just reacted." "Reaction or not," Marcus replied, leaning against the wooden post, "you showed them something they weren't ready to see. Now they'll talk. And talking in this town." His words trailed off, but the warning was clear. Later that night, in her small room, Cassie sat with Eli's photograph in her hands. She whispered to the boy she loved most, though he lay miles away in a hospital bed. "I'm sorry, Eli. I didn't mean to stand out. You need me to keep this job. We need the money. I'll fix it, I promise." But across town, Heather Whitman was not planning to let it go. Heather's bedroom was a shrine to luxury plush carpets, a vanity lined with cosmetics, walls pinned with photos of parties and vacations. She sat before her mirror, brushing her auburn hair with sharp, deliberate strokes, her reflection glaring back at her with icy determination. To her, Cassie's defiance was more than an insult. It was a wound to her pride, inflicted in front of her friends. "She thinks she can embarrass me?" Heather hissed, her voice trembling with fury. Marcy sat nervously on the edge of the bed, twisting the hem of her sundress. Maybe just let it go," Marcy ventured softly. "She didn't really hurt Jason." "And your dad—" "My dad," Heather snapped, spinning on her, "doesn't get embarrassed by servants, and neither do I. Cassie's going to regret this." In her mind, a plan was already forming. Meanwhile, in the Whitman study, Robert Whitman, the mayor, sat at his mahogany desk, his steel-gray eyes scanning a document. When Heather barged in, he raised one eyebrow, irritation flickering across his face. "What is it, Heather?" Heather, usually careful to charm her father, did not hide her anger. "It's Cassie." She humiliated Jason, in front of everyone. "You can't let her stay here." Robert leaned back, folding his hands across his chest. He was a man used to control, both in his family and his town. "Cassie is cheap labor. She does her job. What happened at the pool is irrelevant." Heather's lips tightened. "It's not irrelevant to me," her father sighed, dismissing her. "Then make yourself useful. Learn when to let things pass. This isn't worth my attention." But Heather, unlike her father, had no patience for letting things pass. The next day, Cassie's worst fears began to crystallize. Mrs. Irene Whitman entered the kitchen, her silk blouse crisp, her pale blue eyes colder than usual. "Cassie," she said, her voice like ice, "I've been told you caused a scene yesterday. That sort of behavior is unacceptable." I didn't mean to, ma'am," Cassie replied, bowing her head. "Intentions don't matter," Irene cut in. "This family's reputation is everything. You would do well to remember your place. There won't be another mistake." Her warning hung heavy in the air long after she left. Cassie's hands trembled as she polished the silver, her mind racing. If she lost this job, Eli lost his chance at surgery. Everything she had sacrificed would crumble. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the lake shimmered with streaks of gold, Marcus found Cassie again. He leaned on the fence, his wiry frame outlined against the fading light. "You need to be careful," he said quietly. "Heather won't stop. Girls like her, they don't forgive. They find ways to remind you of your place." Cassie looked at him, her chest tight. "Then what do I do?" Marcus's jaw tightened, his brown eyes steady. "You keep your head down. Work twice as hard. Don't give them another reason. Because if they push you out, Cassie, nobody else here will hire you." "Not in this town." Cassie nodded, though inside her heart roared in protest. To survive, she would have to hide the fire her grandfather had ignited in her. To save Eli, she would have to smother the very part of herself that had saved her life. But as she returned to her small room and lay staring at the ceiling, she knew one truth she could not deny. No matter how carefully she tried to stay invisible, her secret was out. And once a secret is revealed, it cannot be buried again. Rain came the following evening, rolling in heavy from the west, the kind that soaked the red Texas soil and hammered on the tin roofs of barns. Cassie stood at the tall kitchen window of the Whitman estate, watching droplets blur the outlines of Lake Green Ridge. The storm outside matched the one within her chest. Whispers about her outburst had not died down. Instead, they grew. Every delivery boy, every clerk at the gas station, every classmate of Heather's seemed to have something to say about the maid who moved like a fighter. Cassie knew each rumor was another nail in the coffin of her invisibility. But worse news came with the rain. Marcus Reed approached her just before supper, his boots leaving muddy prints on the stone floor. His wiry face was drawn, his brown eyes serious. "Cassie," he said low, "I was in town today. Ran into Nurse Collins at the hospital. It's Eli. He collapsed. They admitted him into intensive care." The words stabbed sharper than any insult Heather could conjure. Cassie nearly dropped the tray she was carrying. "When? Is he?" Marcus shook his head, his weathered hands rising in a calming gesture. "Alive, but weak. They say he'll need surgery sooner than they thought." Cassie swallowed hard, her throat closing. Every hour mattered now. But how could she ever hope to raise that kind of money? She had counted on months, not weeks. Later that night, as she passed by the Whitman study to deliver a pot of tea, she heard voices. She paused, heart thudding. Robert Whitman's deep baritone rumbled, measured and sharp. "We'll move the remainder of the hospital fund before the audit," he was saying. Cassie froze. Another voice answered, Mr. Gerald Beckett, the town treasurer. Beckett was a balding man in his early 60s, his round glasses perched on a crooked nose, his paunch pressing against his suspenders. He always smelled faintly of cigars and carried himself with the smug assurance of someone who had never gone hungry. "No one will question it, Robert. Everyone trusts you. Greenridge sees you as its savior. They'll never know you bled the hospital account dry." Cassie pressed closer, the tray trembling in her hands. Robert Whitman leaned back in his leather chair, his steel-gray eyes narrowing. "It's simple arithmetic. We funnel the money into development projects under my name. By the time anyone notices, contracts will be signed. And the hospital? It'll limp along, same as always." Her breath caught. The money meant for patients like Eli, the fund that might save his life, was being siphoned by the very man who ran the town. She stumbled back, nearly knocking against the wall. The clink of the teapot lid betrayed her. Inside, the voices fell silent. She hurried away before they could open the door. That night she lay awake, staring at the cracked ceiling of her room, listening to the storm fade. Her grandfather's words haunted her. "Stand up, girl, even when it's water all around you." But this was no poolside insult, no careless shove. This was life and death. This was Eli. The next morning, she begged Irene Whitman for a half-day off, claiming she needed to visit her brother. Irene, with her pale blue eyes, sharp as icicles, hesitated. "One day," she said coldly. "If you're late tomorrow, don't bother coming back." Cassie didn't argue. She grabbed her thin coat and hurried through the rain-slicked streets of Greenridge to the hospital. The Greenridge County Hospital was a modest two-story brick building with peeling paint and windows clouded by age. Inside, it smelled of antiseptic and old coffee. Cassie hurried through the halls until she found Eli's room. Eli Monroe lay pale against white sheets, his small frame looking even smaller beneath the blankets. His curly hair clung damply to his forehead, and his chest rose and fell unevenly. Yet when he saw Cassie, his brown eyes lit faintly. "Cass." His voice was fragile, barely more than a whisper. Cassie rushed to his side, taking his cool hand in hers. "I'm here, Eli. I'm right here." Beside the bed, Nurse Emma Collins adjusted an IV. Emma was a woman of 35, slim and graceful, with freckles dusting her pale cheeks and tired green eyes that revealed both compassion and exhaustion. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a tight braid, and she wore navy scrubs that bore the marks of long hours. She gave Cassie a sympathetic glance. "He's stable for now," Emma said softly, "but he needs surgery soon." Without it. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. Cassie squeezed Eli's hand tighter. "We'll find a way," she whispered. "I promise." Emma hesitated before leaning closer. "Cassie, there are rumors about missing funds. The hospital was promised a grant last spring. It vanished before it arrived. Some of us think the mayor's office is involved, but no one dares speak." Her green eyes flicked nervously toward the hallway. "Be careful. People who ask questions in this town, they disappear." Cassie's heart pounded. The puzzle pieces were sliding into place. As she left the hospital, Marcus Reed was waiting outside, leaning against his pickup truck. His wiry frame looked more worn in the daylight, his hands stained from soil and grease. He nodded at her. "I thought you might need a ride." During the drive back, Cassie told him everything she had overheard in the study. Marcus's jaw clenched, his brown eyes flashing with anger. If Whitman's stealing from the hospital fund, half this town's blood is on his hands. But proving it, that's another story. He's got everyone in his pocket, the treasurer, the sheriff, even the newspaper. Cassie stared out the window at the endless stretch of wet fields. "Then I'll find proof myself. For Eli." Marcus looked at her with a mixture of admiration and fear. "You're walking a dangerous road, Cassie. Whitman doesn't play fair." That night, back at the estate, Cassie crept quietly toward the study after the Whitmans had retired. The heavy door stood ajar. Inside, the shelves were lined with ledgers and folders. She slipped in, her heart thudding, and scanned the desk. She found a locked drawer, the brass handle cold under her fingertips. She tugged, but it held fast. A soft sound behind her made her freeze. It was Clara Jenkins, the cook, her round face pale in the dim light. Clara clutched her scarf nervously. "Cassie, what are you doing?" Cassie swallowed hard. "Clara, please. I need to find proof. He's stealing from the hospital. The money that could save Eli." Clara's eyes filled with fear, but also pity. She had known Cassie long enough to see the truth in her face. After a moment, she nodded. "I'll keep watch. But be quick." Cassie bent down, slid a thin knife from her apron pocket, and carefully jimmied the lock. The drawer gave with a soft click. Inside were files labeled with dates, contracts, and one slim folder marked Hospital Fund. Her hands trembled as she flipped it open. Numbers, transfers, signatures. Enough to damn Robert Whitman if shown to the right people. But as she tucked the folder beneath her apron, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Clara hissed, "Go!" Cassie slipped out the side door into the damp night, her heart hammering, the folder pressed against her chest. She knew now what had to be done. She had to protect Eli and expose the truth. But every step she took placed her closer to the wrath of Green Ridge's most powerful man. The Whitman estate blazed with light that Saturday night, every window spilling golden glow into the warm autumn air. Strings of lanterns lined the garden paths, casting flickering halos across manicured hedges. The smell of roasted meats and expensive wine wafted through the night, while the strains of a small string quartet floated from the veranda. It was the Whitmans' annual weekend gala, the most important social event in Green Ridge, where politicians rubbed shoulders with businessmen and the wealthiest families flaunted their power. Cassie stood in her small room, staring at the folded blue dress laid carefully across her bed. It was plain compared to the gowns that would swirl across the ballroom, but it was clean, and it matched the shade of her deep brown eyes. Clara Jenkins had pressed it for her that morning, whispering, "You'll need to stand tall tonight, girl." Shit. Hidden within the folds of the dress, secured against her skin with tape, was the folder of hospital fund documents she had stolen. Her heart thudded with the weight of it. The grand ballroom shimmered with crystal chandeliers, their prisms scattering light across polished marble floors. Guests mingled in clusters, men in tailored suits, women in glittering gowns that shimmered like jewels. Robert Whitman, the mayor, towered near the head table, his steel gray eyes sharp as he shook hands with donors. Irene Whitman, elegant in a silver gown, moved gracefully among the guests, her smile practiced, her blue eyes cold. Heather was the evening's star. She swept into the room in a crimson gown that hugged her tall frame, her auburn curls arranged in an elaborate style that glittered with jeweled pins. At her side clung Marcy Turner, in a pale pink dress, laughing too loudly, and Jason Crowley, his broad shoulders stuffed into a tuxedo he wore with arrogant ease. Kevin Myers trailed behind, thinner than ever in an ill-fitting suit, his nervous energy making him twitch at every glance. Cassie entered quietly through the side door, her hands steady even as her heart quaked. The hum of voices faltered when eyes fell on her. Whispers rushed through the crowd. That's the maid, the fighter, the Monroe girl. Some eyes carried curiosity, others disdain, and a few, like Marcus Reed's from the back of the hall, carried pride. Marcus had dressed awkwardly in a borrowed suit, his wiry frame stiff, but his brown eyes sought Cassie's, offering silent encouragement. Heather's lips curled into a smirk when she spotted her. She whispered something to Jason, who chuckled darkly. The crowd parted slightly as Heather strode forward, her crimson gown trailing like spilled wine. "Well, well," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "The maid decides to play guest." How charming laughter rippled through her circle. Cassie did not flinch. She held her shoulders square, her gaze level. For years she had hidden behind silence. Tonight she chose to be seen. Heather's eyes narrowed. "What's wrong?" "Cat got your tongue? Or do you only know how to talk with your fists?" She lunged suddenly, as if to shove Cassie the way she had at the pool, but Cassie moved with calm precision. She sidestepped, her hand rising to redirect Heather's momentum. A subtle twist, a controlled sweep. Heather staggered, her arms flailing until she caught herself against the marble column. The crowd gasped. Jason surged forward, but Cassie's stance shifted fluidly, her palm raised in quiet warning, her movements echoing discipline rather than aggression. The hall fell silent. The quartet faltered and stopped playing. All eyes were on the girl in the plain blue dress who had just deflected Greenridge's golden daughter without breaking a sweat. Cassie's voice rang clear, stronger than anyone had ever heard it. "I'm not here to fight. I'm here because you deserve to know the truth." From within her dress, she pulled the folder, the papers trembling only slightly in her hands. Gasps echoed through the crowd. Robert Whitman's face drained of color, his steel gray eyes flashing with alarm. "These," Cassie continued, her voice steady, "are records showing the hospital fund was stolen. Money meant for patients' children, families was taken by the very man who stands before you as mayor. Robert Whitman." A murmur surged through the hall, waves of disbelief and outrage. Sheriff Harold Davis, a stocky man in his 50s with thinning gray hair and calculating brown eyes, stepped forward. His uniform fit too tightly around his thick frame, and his expression was one of discomfort rather than surprise. He had long been in Whitman's pocket. "That's a serious accusation, girl," he said, his voice slow, deliberate. "You'd better have proof." Cassie lifted the pages high. "It's all here dates, transfers, signatures. Proof enough to damn him." Nurse Emma Collins, who had been invited to the gala as a guest of a sympathetic doctor, stepped from the back of the hall. Her green eyes blazed with courage as she called out, "She's telling the truth." "I've seen patients denied care because those funds vanished. Eli Monroe is one of them. That boy lies in a hospital bed tonight because this man chose greed over mercy." All eyes swung back to the mayor. Robert Whitman's composure cracked, his jaw tightening, sweat beating at his temple. Heather's face paled, her crimson lips trembling. Jason growled, "She's lying." But Marcus Reed's voice cut across the hall, rough and unyielding. "No, she's not." I heard Whitman and Beckett myself. They talked about moving the money. I kept quiet too long, but not anymore. His wiry frame seemed taller in that moment, his weathered face fierce with conviction. The room erupted into chaos. Guests shouted, some in disbelief, others in anger. Robert tried to raise his voice above the din, his baritone booming, but the tide had turned. A group of townsfolk surged forward, demanding answers. Irene Whitman's pale blue eyes swept the crowd with icy fury, but even she could not contain the storm. Cassie stood firm, the folder clutched against her chest, her heart hammering but her gaze steady. She had done it. She had brought the truth into the light. Whatever happened next, she was no longer invisible. She was no longer silent. The Whitman Gala ended not with dancing, but with chaos. The next morning, Greenridge awoke to a different kind of sunrise, one painted not just in pale autumn gold, but in the heavy whispers of scandal. News spread across town faster than wildfire. The mayor was accused of stealing from the hospital fund. Farmers at the feed store, mothers outside the schoolyard, and even the old men on benches outside the courthouse repeated the same stunned words, "Robert Whitman may fall." Reporters from the Greenridge Gazette parked outside the Whitman estate. The Gazette was usually tame, printing stories about county fairs and cattle auctions, but its lead journalist, Daniel Harper, had long been waiting for a chance to dig deeper. Daniel was in his 40s, lean and sharp-featured, with thinning dark hair combed neatly and piercing hazel eyes that missed little. His rolled-up shirt sleeves revealed wiry arms, and he carried a notepad tucked perpetually into his back pocket. Years of being ignored by bigger newspapers had given him a restless hunger for truth. Now, with Cassie's evidence, he had a story that could topple a dynasty. The town's sheriff, Harold Davis, who had once turned a blind eye, found himself cornered. His heavy-set frame looked smaller as crowds demanded accountability. He was not a brave man. His small, watery brown eyes flickered constantly, searching for safety. And safety, he realized, no longer lay with Robert Whitman. Under mounting pressure, Davis called for state investigators. By Monday, sleek black sedans with government plates rolled into Greenridge. From them emerged two investigators from the Texas State Attorney's Office. The first, Special Agent Laura Ramirez, was a tall, commanding woman in her late 30s. Her olive skin and raven black hair tied in a severe bun, framed eyes dark and intelligent, eyes that could cut through lies with surgical precision. Her charcoal suit was simple but carried authority. At her side was Agent Thomas Green in his mid-40s, stockier, with sandy blonde hair graying at the temples and a calm steadiness in his blue eyes. He wore a plain navy suit, the type that made him blend into any crowd, but his presence radiated patience and resolve. Together they strode into the Whitman estate, badges gleaming, and by afternoon Robert Whitman's study was cordoned off, files boxed, and computers seized. The mayor, once untouchable, stood pale and furious as flashbulbs popped. His steel-gray eyes, once filled with confidence, now darted like a trapped animal. Heather Whitman watched the downfall unfold with a hollow expression. The crimson glamour of the gala had faded. Her auburn curls now hung loose, her face bare of the polish she once wore like armor. Alone in her gilded bedroom, she stared at family portraits that once inspired pride, but now felt like prison bars. For the first time, she faced her reflection not as Greenridge's princess, but as the daughter of a thief. Beneath her icy veneer, Heather was just 18, confused, frightened, and suddenly aware of how fragile her world truly was. Meanwhile, at the Greenridge County Hospital, a different storm brewed. Cassie hurried down the halls, her blue dress replaced with a borrowed cardigan and jeans, her braid neat but fraying. Eli had worsened. Machines beeped steadily, and his small body looked fragile beneath blankets. Nurse Emma Collins, with her tired green eyes, met Cassie at the door. "The surgery is scheduled," Emma whispered. "The state froze the Whitman accounts but released the stolen funds back to the hospital. We finally have enough." Cassie's knees nearly buckled with relief. She pressed her forehead against Eli's, whispering promises he might barely hear. "You'll get your chance, Eli. Just hold on." The surgeon who stepped in to brief them was Dr. Benjamin Carter, a man in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and a face lined by both wisdom and fatigue. His square jaw and steady brown eyes projected calm reassurance. He had been in Greenridge for decades, treating families across generations, and the weight of limited resources had worn him down. Yet tonight his voice held hope. "Your brother has a good chance now. We'll do everything we can." The surgery stretched for hours. Cassie sat in the waiting room, her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Marcus Reed sat across from her, still in his work boots, offering quiet company. "You did this," he said finally. His rough voice carried pride. "You brought the truth out. Don't forget that when Dr. Carter finally emerged, his brown eyes tired but shining, Cassie rose so quickly she nearly stumbled. "He's stable," Carter said. "The surgery was a success." Cassie's breath broke into sobs, the kind she had held back for years. Marcus looked away, giving her privacy, but the corners of his mouth lifted faintly. News of the successful surgery spread almost as quickly as the news of Robert Whitman's downfall. For the people of Greenridge, the two stories intertwined: the boy saved, the mayor exposed, the maid who had stood against power. Days later, in the town square, Daniel Harper published a full-page article, "The Silent Girl Who Spoke." His words painted Cassie not as a servant, but as a symbol, and his hazel eyes gleamed as he handed her a copy. "They'll remember this," he told her, "and they'll remember you." Cassie, who had once been invisible, now walked through Greenridge with her head high. Shopkeepers greeted her with nods of respect. Mothers whispered her name to their children as an example. Even those who had once sneered now looked away in shame. Heather crossed paths with Cassie a week later outside the hospital. She looked smaller without her entourage, her pale face bare of arrogance. For a moment, words failed her. Then, with a voice almost fragile, she said, I'm sorry for everything." Cassie studied her, seeing not an enemy but a girl stripped of illusions. She nodded slowly. "We all have to live with the truth, Heather. That's the hardest part." The days turned into weeks. Robert Whitman faced indictment, his empire crumbling. Heather quietly left Greenridge for college, her letters to Marcy unreturned. The hospital thrived with restored funds, new equipment humming in its halls. Eli walked again, weaker but smiling, his brown eyes brighter each day. He told anyone who would listen that his sister was the strongest person alive. And Cassie Monroe, once the silent maid, became something greater. She began teaching self-defense classes in the community center, her precise movements showing young girls and weary mothers alike that strength could be learned, that silence could be broken. Marcus helped fix the leaky roof of the center. Clara baked pies for every class, and even Nurse Emma attended, her tired green eyes lighter now. In Greenridge, people began to speak of her name not with pity, but with pride. The ending came not with fanfare, but with a quiet evening by Lake Greenridge. Cassie stood with Eli at the pier, the autumn breeze ruffling their hair. The lake shimmered in twilight, the same lake where she had once been shoved, mocked, nearly drowned. She held Eli's hand and breathed deeply. Strength, she realized, had never been about fists or fury. It was about endurance, sacrifice, and the courage to step into the light when silence was safer. The people of Greenridge would remember her not as the maid, but as the girl who saved her brother, exposed the powerful, and reminded them all that dignity was not for sale. Sometimes life pushes us down into deep waters, just like Cassie was pushed into that pool. But what defines us is not the fall, it is how we rise. True strength is not about wealth, power, or how loud we speak. It is found in quiet courage, in the love we carry for those we protect, and in the choice to stand for what is right even when it costs us everything. In our own daily lives, we face struggles that may seem invisible to others, yet each of us has the chance to rise above, to fight for our families, our values, and our dignity. Let Cassie's story remind us that no matter how small or unseen we may feel, faith and perseverance can change everything. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs encouragement, leave a comment below, and subscribe to our channel for more stories of hope and courage. May God bless you and your loved ones. Comment Amen if you believe that even in silence, God gives us the strength to stand tall.